Okay, so this is our video lecture on the framing of the Constitution itself, which is just to give you an introduction before we do our clause-by-clause read-through of the Constitution. This is here for your own purposes. You can tell what you need to take out of it. I'll make sure to emphasize, because there is some excess information out of this, since I'm a historian and I like this stuff. All right, so let's start with the Articles themselves. Now, one of the things you have to stop and realize is that while we like to critique the Articles, while we like to make fun of them and say, oh, the Articles are so dumb, they clearly weren't an appropriate form of government, they made sense at the time, first. They made a lot of sense at the time, as we'll go over. And in addition, they did get a lot of things done. The United States won the war for independence under the Articles government. The United States successfully governed itself for almost 12 years under the Articles government. The United States carved out territory in the West and divided it up and began to establish a system for bringing it into the Union under the Articles. So it was not as useless as the Federalists would make it appear during the ratification debate. Let's go over some of its basic characteristics. The Articles government had one unicameral legislature. That was it. Now that actually made a lot of sense. Let's think about why. Even though the framers were used to a bicameral system, and indeed a lot of their state legislatures had bicameral systems, that didn't mean that they thought of bicameral systems as good of necessity. They were only necessary in a lot of ways because of what they represented. Now in, let's say, Pennsylvania, you needed to have a bicameral legislature because you represented both property and you represented the population. In England, back in the home country, they needed a bicameral legislature because you had a house that represented the lords and the established nobility, and you had a house that represented the nation, the people, sort of, the parliament. That was the House of Commons. But when it came to the Articles government, were there two things to represent? No, not really. The only thing the Articles government needed to represent were the states which composed it. And so it only made sense to create one house, a house in which each state had one vote. Each state having one vote is really crucial here, because with 13 colonies and no more added during the time they were under the Articles, that meant that a majority vote was very difficult to achieve. You had to really create strong coalitions, and a small coalition of related interests, especially a small coalition of small states, could easily defeat any bill or measure that they thought would be a problem. So you had one vote per state. That meant 13 total votes that you had to get for a lot of different stuff. The state legislatures were the ones who sent representatives, too, which meant that you did not necessarily get the cream of the crop, because so much power was vested in the states. Remember that Article 2 of the Articles said that states were still considered free and sovereign entities. It was considered more exciting and probably better for your future political prospects to be an important member of your state legislature than it was to be your state's representative to the Articles Congress. It just was not a great idea. So a lot of the people who were being sent to the Articles Congress were people who were directly the creatures of the state legislatures. They were totally dependent on them. Now that's exactly as the framers of the Article wanted it. That made a lot of sense because the states were the ones whose interests were supposed to be protected and furthered by the Articles, right? But this, as you'll see, works out to be kind of a problem because individuals will want to go back to their state legislatures, they'll be recalled, they'll be disinterested in their jobs, they won't come, etc. The system that it sets up doesn't need an independent executive or an independent judiciary. This again makes sense. They're going to rely on the 13 separate executives of the 13 separate states to carry out their will, and their laws will be enforceable by the 13 separate judiciary systems. Again, makes sense. If there needs to be some kind of tribunal, it can be composed of the states, because the Articles Congress is composed of representatives of the states who can freely judge a conflict between them. Makes a lot of sense. They require unanimous consent to alter the Articles. This is one of the ones that's a little bit harder to see the immediate reason for, but it's also the one that causes the most problem. It means that if any single state feels that a change in the Articles, let's say a change in the requirement that Congress not levy any money directly, might threaten its interests, they alone can block that change. This is a really big change from the previous system of Confederation. So let's keep moving really quickly here. Theoretically, the Articles Congress had a monopoly on foreign power, but it was going to have a hard time enforcing it, especially the power to regulate foreign trade, which states retained in some really important ways. They would be able to create kind of a most favored nation status. So if Massachusetts wanted to trade a little bit more with Great Britain, or if South Carolina found it very convenient to trade with Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, it quickly became apparent they would find ways to do that. And they would find ways to do that that often worked to the disadvantage of the trade of the other states. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, to the effectiveness of the government. Now, the Articles provision for amendment was important to its future, but for its effectiveness in the here and now, the way it dealt with taxes was crucial. The way taxes would work was this. The Articles government would determine a fair way to figure out what each state owed for the fulfillment of their collective obligations. Again, this again makes sense. Think about the way the Articles power is set up. So each state will set up a way then to pay that obligation. It's required to do so. But you notice where it puts the power. It puts the power to determine the obligation in the hands of the Articles Congress, but the power to tax closer to the people. The power to tax, that is, raise the money to pay the obligation, lies with the state legislatures. Now, the state legislatures will not always want to pay. They'll often have trouble paying. But nonetheless, you can see again why this makes sense in the wake of the Revolution and the Declaration and all the troubles around that period, and the way it's consistent with the Lockean principles that we've been talking about. Now, Madison was not a fan, and you guys read the most snarky document in American history, The Vices of the Political System of the United States. You can go and refer to the copy of it on the class website if you want to go and take a look again. It's not particularly hard to read. He indicts all of what he sees as the biggest problems of the Articles government. Now, the convention itself gets off to a rocky start. Sure, there are these problems, which we discussed and which Madison talks about in the Vices of the Political System. But the first attempt, the really first serious attempt to get together a group of people who want to change significant elements of the way the states work among themselves, the Annapolis Conference, doesn't really end up working out. Not enough people come. There are a series of kind of humorous bungles of people trying to show up or not having directions and not having empowerment that's sufficient to the goals of the Annapolis Convention. Overall, it's a very frustrating convention. But what it does do is agree that they're going to create another meeting. They're going to create another meeting in Philadelphia in a few months that will hopefully avoid the bungles of the Annapolis Convention. Everyone will have a sufficiently empowered charter from their state legislature, more states will come, and so on. Now, what's useful in a certain sense to know is that after the Annapolis Convention and before the Philadelphia Convention, you have a gigantic uprising in upstate Massachusetts of poor farmers. These guys had been kicked around and abused. Many of them hadn't had their wages paid. Many of them were soldiers from the Revolutionary War. The judicial system of Massachusetts didn't offer them any options to pay their debts. They were being thrown in debtor's prison. They were having their farms repossessed by the banks, and they really felt like this was the whole set of events that led to the American Revolution playing itself out in miniature in Massachusetts. They felt that the central government of Massachusetts, headquartered in Boston, was not listening to the pleas and the grief of its citizens, and they were quite prepared to go and reenact the revolutionary drama with themselves as the patriots and the government of Massachusetts as the king and as England. So it ended, but only ended after the Massachusetts state government was actually able to hire mercenaries. They had to spend a bunch of money, which they raised through private means. They didn't even raise it through taxes. They raised money from wealthy merchants to hire mercenaries to reorganize the Massachusetts state militia and finally go and put down the revolt. So this was a symptom of the underlying problems that people like Madison saw in the Vices. And so by the time we get to the Philadelphia Convention, the kind of people who are there are all more or less ardent nationalists. They see the whole series of problems that were expounded in the Vices, and many of them from long experience in either the Continental Army or the Continental Congress or state legislatures that had had a lot of trouble, see a necessity for a stronger central government. And some of them come in thinking they can do this through a unanimous amendment of the Articles, but after the Annapolis Convention, most of them come in with the idea that they're going to create a new document, an entirely new plan of government. And they are a pretty elite bunch. Now, they're not all wealthy, landowning, high-class, aristocratic types, but they are all white, male, and much better educated than the norm in the colonies. Now, this is to be expected, right? When you invite a bunch of people to go and write a constitution, a bunch of ironmongers probably aren't going to show up. But it is worth keeping in mind when you think about their worldviews, the kind of things that they consider important, and the kind of compromises they'll be willing to make. If they make a compromise about something like, let's say, African American rights, none of them are going to be personally affected by that compromise. So it's an easier thing for them to compromise about than, say, paper currency, right? And when they get there, they do decide that they are there to consider changes to or a replacement of the Articles. It's important to know that, because when the meeting happened at Philadelphia, it wasn't clear that that's what they were there to do. The original agreement at Annapolis was just that they would meet again to talk about interstate trade and agreements. Once everyone arrives at Philadelphia, and Madison gets there well before everybody else to set this up, it becomes clear that they're not just there to discuss interstate trade or solving specific problems like Shays' Rebellion, but instead to draft a whole new plan of government. And boy, do they ever come prepared. Some of them especially prepared. James Madison had spent the entire summer reading through a long list of books, rereading and rewriting his notes on ancient and modern confederacies and nations, rereading and rewriting his vices. He came in there a lean, mean constitution-writing machine, and he also came in with a plan. Now, if you guys learn any one thing from James Madison, it's to come with a plan. Because the plan he came with, which we're about to talk about, the Virginia Plan of Government, would dominate the discussion for the entire rest of the Constitutional Convention. Everyone got to Philadelphia, settled in, and Madison set the agenda. Now, the Virginia Plan would change a lot, and in many ways, Madison didn't like the changes that were made to it. He was not perfectly happy with the final Constitution. He would have preferred to propose the Virginia Plan, have it fleshed out and ratified, and be done with it. But the Constitution that we do have ended up looking a lot like the plan that Madison prepared in the weeks going into the convention. And that's really crucial. So tune into the next video where we're going to talk about Madison's Virginia Plan, how it was received by the convention, and then we're going to talk about the New Jersey Plan that rose up in opposition to it, and go over some of the big compromises that are in the final plan.